Marx and the Communist Manifesto. So we begin today by looking at the figures of Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, and Friedrich Engels, who lived from 1820 to 1895. Karl Marx was born into a Jewish family in Treves, Prussia, but his father converted to Lutheranism in order to further his career. In 1895, Marx went to the University of Bonn to study law, but his father became concerned because he found his son becoming attached to what he called politically subversive groups, basically left-wingers, and so he was transferred to the more conservative University of Berlin. He studied there with law and philosophy, graduating in 1841. In 1842, he became a journalist in Cologne, where he became the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, basically the Rhineland newspaper. And his editorials became increasingly more and more radical all the time, and so the Prussian government sought to censor him. In doing so, they closed down the entire newspaper. In 1844, Marx is going to establish a relationship at the University of Berlin with Friedrich Engels. Now, Friedrich Engels was born in Barnum, Prussia. His father was an industrialist who owned a cotton mill. Actually, he owned several cotton mills in both Prussia and England. And so, in 1841, at the University of Berlin, Marx and Engels, both acting as radicals, formed a partnership that would last them off and on throughout their life. They are going to write a number of different pieces, but primarily what they become known for is what is called the Communist Manifesto. One of the great ironies, of course, is that the Communist Manifesto, this movement that is supposed to be a movement of the lower orders, the working class, was actually started by a group of upper middle class German intellectuals. It begins in London and grows from there. Essentially, both of these men will find themselves in exile in England, having been run out of Prussia, having been run out of France in Marx's case. They will find themselves in England under exile, and that's where they create this Communist Manifesto. Now, to understand what's going on, we have to talk a little bit about the situation that brings it about. The fact is that if we go back through our history, we find that throughout most of it, people lived off of the land. Individuals would go out into the fields, they would work, they grew off of the land, and of course there has always been the elites who possess land and property and the poorer classes who do not. But not a lot of people noticed at the time because the land provided the basic necessities for what people needed. But as we went on through time, we found that particularly in the Middle Ages, those people who had certain skills and abilities were able to form guilds, and they began to live in the towns. Well, those people started to gain a certain degree of wealth and independence that the people living on the land did not. And so people began to think, people who live in the cities, who work in these skilled trades, they are the ones who are succeeding. They're the ones who are doing well. We poor hicks living off the land, what do we have? All right. But the Industrial Revolution comes along, and that's going to change everything. Now we have these big, massive factories that are brought into being. And people are going to come from all over to take jobs in these factories. They are leaving the land, they're coming into the cities hoping for a better life, hoping for a better existence. But it backfires. Because the factories, let's face it, we might open a new factory that needs 1,000 employees. But there's 5,000 people that have made their way in from the city, or made their way into the city, rather, and those people are looking for work. Well, that means the people who own those factories can pay the lowest wage they can possibly get away with. They can have long and dangerous working hours. And if you don't like it, well, you're free to leave because I've got 10, 20 people waiting to fill your spot. If you get injured on the job, too bad, you're gone. I'm going to bring in one of the other, dozen people that's waiting to fill your position. And so rather than improving the condition of individuals by moving into the city, it made them worse. Most people found themselves living in shared rooms, in tenement buildings that are falling down, working 14-hour-a-day shifts 6 days a week for starvation wages. And this is what really exacerbates that distinction that Marx is going to talk about between the haves and the have-nots. Now, the Communist Manifesto is published in 1844, and as I said, it was published in England originally, and it's going to grow from there. This was meant to be a call to arms to all working people, to all working classes, because as Marx indicated, this has to be a revolution that starts at the bottom. Those people who have authority, those people who have power, they're not going to be willing to let go of that. They're not going to hand over that power willingly. They are going to have it wrested away from them by those lower orders. So it has to be an uprising from the bottom. But Marx also argued that once people realized how much better off they would be under this system without any class antagonism, then everyone would find the benefit of living under this communistic regime. The opening lines to the preface of the Communist Manifesto are very interesting and very telling, and I've got them for you on the screen here. It says, "A spectre haunts Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance in order to lay this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police. Where's the opposition party which has not been stigmatized as communist by those who wield power? Where's the opposition party which has not hurled back this scandalous charge of communism in the teeth of its adversaries, whether progressive or reactionary?" Those opening lines, "A spectre haunts Europe, the spectre of communism," they sound like eerie rhetoric. And if this had been written in the 1950s, it would have scared a lot of people. But in the 1840s, there wasn't a single communist nation anywhere in the world. Communism was an idea that was bandied around that nobody properly understood. And so what we have here is this idea that he's talking about, where all we do is, if there's somebody who is your opposition, it doesn't matter what side you're on. If you have an opposition, you call them a communist. This is a mentality that we still have today. Right? How many times have you heard people from the right call people from the left communists? How many times have you heard people from the left call people on the right fascist? We bandy about these labels without properly even understanding what they are. And so Marx says we need to put it down clearly what communism entails, so that we understand the basic principles, the basic ideas of this movement, so that people don't just label my opposition by this name and it becomes nothing more than a derogatory terminology. And so Marx begins, the manifesto is actually divided up into 4 different sections, and in the first section of it, it talks about the concept of the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. It talks about the historical background of that movement, and then you move on to the second part, the proletarians and the communists. Then the third part talks about some of the literature that exists out there, and then the fourth part is that call to arms that we mentioned earlier. But anyway, within Marx's writings here, he wants to introduce these 2 important topics of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the class of modern capitalists, the owners of social production and the employers of wage labor. The proletariat is the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are forced to sell their labor power in order to survive. So basically, the bourgeoisie are the people who own the businesses, who employ the proletariat. The proletariat are the workers. The terminology here actually stems from historical sources. In the Middle Ages, the bourgeoisie, it simply meant the city dwellers. These were the people who lived in the cities. But as we mentioned before, the people living in the cities were those who had the skilled jobs, the people who belonged to the guilds, and therefore they were the ones, when industry came around, who had the capital to invest in it, and therefore to make the benefits of it. The proletariat, on the other hand, that term comes from ancient Rome, and it basically meant the poverty-stricken, landless class of people that made up, quite honestly, 90% of the Roman population. And so he's using those historical allusions to show the difference between these two categories, between these two groups of people. So the bourgeoisie, the owners of production, the proletariats, the workers. Now, because of the gap, the chasm that comes into play between these two groups, we end up having class warfare, and we end up with a lot of antagonism, a lot of hatred, a lot of problems. The bourgeoisie looks their nose down upon the proletariat. They are the great unwashed. They are the filthy masses. They are the sweats. We're not going to be concerned with their interests. But yet, the bourgeoisie need the proletariat, because without their labor, they would not be able to make the money to keep themselves in that position. The proletariat, of course, they envy the bourgeoisie. They would secretly like to be like them and have that luxury in that position. But they also despise the way they're being treated by the bourgeoisie, and that creates a lot of hatred towards them. They look down, they're looked down upon, and they don't like that. So there's that antagonism and hatred. Well, what's going to happen through communism is that there will be a joining of those two classes into one singular group, that of the communist. The communist. In the communist regime, the bourgeoisie would stay the bourgeoisie because everyone is an owner of social production, but they would also be lowered to the level of proletariat because everyone is also a worker. And by that same token, of course, the proletariat would stay proletariat but also be raised to the bourgeoisie. There would be no difference, no distinction between them. They would essentially be the same. This is based upon the idea largely of two individuals. One, Friedrich Hegel, who you met in a previous chapter. This is where the idea of dialectic comes from. The dialectic was that idea that we have the thesis, the antithesis, and then the Aufhebung, the synthesis, the joining of those two. Well, that's what Marx sees happening. The proletariat is the thesis, the bourgeoisie, the antithesis, and communism would be the Aufhebung, the synthesis between those two, the joining of the two into one. The other individual is Feuerbach. Ludwig Feuerbach wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity, and in it he explained that as human beings we have the capacity to have great knowledge of all things, but we also don't want to take the time. We want answers now. And so we began projecting things onto this mythical being that we've called God. Now, as science begins to grow, we gain more and more knowledge, and so we take back into ourselves more and more of those things that we had projected onto God. Now, that's where the materialism comes from, because Hegel's view, right, phenomenology des Geistes, phenomenology of spirit, he included the spiritual aspect, the religious aspect. Marx is an atheist, and so he doesn't want that, so he uses Feuerbach to bring in the materialistic aspect. Hence, he refers to his theory as dialectical materialism, and that's what is used to bring communism into the world, he says. There are within communism, within the text, 10 basic goals of communism that are laid out. The abolition of private property, the fact that there should be a heavy progressive income tax, the abolition of the rights of inheritance, the confiscation of property rights. There needs to be a central bank. The government ownership of communications and transportation needs to take place. The government needs to own all the factories and agriculture. The government needs to control all labor. There is to be set up corporate farming and regional planning. And there should be free education for all children in public schools. And there needs to be a combination of education along with industrial production. These 10 points were supposed to gear us towards the idea of what communism is. But there's one important thing here that so many people who advocate communism fail to grasp. And that is, Marx says that in the beginning these steps are necessary. In the beginning there has to be a government that is going to be strong and powerful and dictatorial. This revolution is going to come. It's going to be very bloody. It's going to be very violent. The government is going to become totalitarian. It's going to enforce these ideas. But after a while, people will come to realize how much better off they are in this system. They will see the antagonism disappear because there are no more classes. There are only the people. And once that happens, he says government can wither away and die. There will be no need for government anymore, and we can be returned back to that original state of nature from which we came. And that's what every one of the people who advocated this view failed to understand. When Lenin brings communism to Russia in 1917, when Mao brings it to China in 1949, they get the part about the bloody revolution. They get the part about establishing a dictatorial control. But they never get to the point that they're supposed to give up that power eventually. They never get to the point that government should wither away and die and allow people to live as individuals in that original state of nature. Marx intended communism to become a liberating force, one that brought us complete and absolute freedom. But everyone who grabs hold of it from that point onwards, what do they do with it? Well, those people take hold of it, they twist it, they add their own take upon it, and they use it to establish themselves as totalitarian dictators. Marx forgot one important thing, and that's human nature. His idea sounds great on paper, but when it's put into practice, every time it fails, because human nature will not allow it to succeed.